We have a track record of standing on the side of love, justice, and peace. We have radical roots and a history of self-motivated spiritual people. We think for ourselves and recognize that life experience influences our beliefs more than anything. We need not think alike to love alike. We are people of many beliefs and backgrounds, people with a religious background, people with none, people who believe in a God, people who don't, and people who let the mystery be. We are Unitarian Universalist and Buddhist and Christian, Hindu, humanist, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, atheist, agnostic, believers in God, and much more. On the forefront of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer inclusion for more than 40 years, we are people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. We seek to welcome you, your whole self, with all your truths and your doubts, your worries and your hopes. Join us on this extraordinary adventure of faith. I think that does a pretty good job summarizing. As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, Reverend Don Cooley and I will do our best to answer your burning questions today about Unitarian Universalism and all that it has to offer, or has offered in the past. There you go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is such a joy to be here with you today. I hope you have questions burning in your brains that you're just dying. Oh, I'm seeing some nodding. Yay!
All right. We do have a bowl of questions too if we need to spark it. But considering we have a willing person to start us.
Are you ready?
Yes, maybe.
I'm going to lead up to my question with a kind of a joke. Universalists say that God is too good to condemn us, and Unitarians say we are too good to be condemned. So is there, I realize that we are allowed to have our personal search for what's our personal truth, but is there an answer to what happens to us after we die? Is there, if you as ministers are asked this question, how do you respond? Can you give us a general answer, a specific answer? I just don't know the answer to this. I have my answer, but I don't know.
Yeah, let me just answer the greatest question to the universe.
I'm so grateful to be a UU because I don't believe in hell anymore, but anyway, back to your question. My question.
I think the answer is that we all have different answers, right? Yeah, and you have space to have different answers here. There's not one way to think about it. And I think that's the beauty of it. You can turn to your neighbor and ask what their opinion is on it, and they'll have something totally different than what your other neighbor might say. The general consensus among people that I've spoken to that identify as Unitarian Universalists is that our energy never ceases, essentially. That it just gets rearranged in the universe, and that's eternity for them, and that's enough. Although certainly I've heard people who truly believe in an afterlife and in the idea of heaven, and perhaps not in that, white castle in the sky kind of a way, but that you enter into this place of eternal love and goodness and warmth.
I think one of the most important things that unites Unitarian Universalism around the idea of what happens when we die is a sense of humility. That we acknowledge that we don't know. That this is what I believe, and that's what you believe. But it's not a dogmatic belief for any of us. We're all open to, well, I really don't know, but this is what I think happens. And so I think that is actually the underlying unification, not the belief itself, but the fact that we hold it lightly and with humility.
And that as Universalists, we kind of believe we're all going to be there together wherever it is. That's right. So,
I have a question, and that is, if you're a humanist, why do you really need to be a Unitarian Universalist as well?
good question.
Repeat the question.
So not all humanists do need to be Unitarian Universalists. There are humanists who are atheists, who don't worship at all, who are secular humanists. There are humanists who are in Christian congregations, in Jewish congregations. Humanists can be all over the place. Humanism did find a special home within Unitarian Universalism, though, and many of our ministers, when humanism was really beginning to flourish, were involved in that movement because it resonated so much with what we believe about how human beings are the dominant force of influence on this planet, and that if we want something to happen, it is up to us to make it happen, not to appeal to a divine being that may or may not exist. And so you don't necessarily need to be a Unitarian Universalist in order to be a humanist. But you'll find that there's a lot, because we acknowledge again around humility, that whether or not there is a divine being, we hold that with humility as well, just as we hold we don't know what happens when you die. But we understand that we are the force. We are God's hands if you're a theist. We are the people who are putting our hands on the moral arc of the universe, if you want Theodore Parker language. It is up to us, and that's a very humanist belief. And I'll just briefly summarize. I had an internship supervisor who explained to me that humanism was Unitarian Universalists' ethic. It was our underlying ethic. And I think that summarizes the relationship between the two quite well.
From a personal experience, I spent a year with the humanist community up at Harvard doing my field education work there. And I'll tell you, at the end of that year, I knew the difference between humanism and Unitarian Universalism. And of course they overlap. But the reason I chose to be a Unitarian Universalist minister versus being a humanist celebrant and going through that educational experience was because when I left that community, and it's changed and matured in beautiful ways since then, I felt as though the significant milestones in our lives were not being properly celebrated. And that the things that I really enjoyed and missed about being a Unitarian Universalism, the intimacy, the vulnerability, and the ritual and singing was really important, and it wasn't there. And so I felt just very devoid of that emotional side of myself. I felt very stimulated intellectually, but my emotional side was not fed at all. And I went directly from their goodbye service to their seniors who were leaving, which was a toss of a t-shirt that was left over and a great job, good luck in the future, to the Unitarian Universalist celebration of their ministers who were leaving. And there was singing and dancing and tears and ritual, and it was amazing. And I wept and I wept and I wept because I'd gone a whole year without feeling that side of me really being nurtured. And so that's when I knew I absolutely needed this part of it. I had to become a UU in this tradition versus just becoming a humanist celebrant for that reason. I think community in general, you can be a lone star, a lone wolf humanist that exists out in the world without a way to plug into a community. And Unitarian Universalism has for a long, long time held that as a way to plug in as a humanist to a community, to have people there when you go in the hospital and you need some help, when you want to celebrate on a Sunday morning, or you want to get married, or you have a child and you want to celebrate that's been historically a really good way to plug in.
You guys are having some really deep questions. I'm impressed.
I saw one over here and one in the back, and then there was this one's not deep. My grandfather wrote in his memoirs he was very involved in the World Council of Churches, and it was very exciting. He had all these denominations. And then I heard from somebody that, the Unitarian Universalists they were not invited or whatever to participate in the World Council of Churches. And I think there's a lot of that going on. It was in Africa, different places anyway. And so my question was, at what time did they finally allow, because I think it was pretty much the religions that believe in the Trinity, so Baptists, they had all those kind of denominations, but we were excluded. So do you know when that they are involved in that now, invited to those world
So what I can tell you is that in Kentucky, where I am, the Unitarian Universalist congregations are not invited to participate in the World Council of Churches. I don't know what the situation is in Georgia. My guess is that based on that it's sort of a hit or miss, depending on what part of the country you're in. There was also somebody behind. So I saw a woman in the back, and then somebody behind, and then the gentleman in the blue stripes.
One of the things that I really love about our religion is the social action, social justice aspect. What do you see as our focus in the next 5 to 10 years?
Racial justice.
And how
That's
do
an easy
you
one.
see us working to coordinate and move with that?
So this is a great question, and I think that one of the things this question acknowledges is we kind of move through eras. We were very active on the front of same-sex marriage and civil rights for GLBT people. We're starting to really we really challenge the world around gender identity and understanding that gender is not binary. And though we're still moving through that and processing through that now, we're starting to realize that that racial justice is extremely important in this country. That the country and therefore all the institutions within the country are founded on a white supremacy system, a way of understanding that white people have more inherent worth and dignity. And so what does that look like in our congregations and in our Unitarian Universalist institutions, and then how do we confront and change that? So not only are we looking outside in how to stand against the white supremacists, which I know you guys have been working on here, but also what does that mean for how we look at our own way of being together, and how do we perpetuate these systems without even realizing it. So it's sort of this twofold, both inward and outward looking, and I see that as the challenge, not just for Unitarian Universalism, but for our country. And because we want to be on the forefront, we will be involved in that dialogue.
Yeah, and at the same time, still be working on other issues.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that will be, I think you'll see a lot around that, but we're still working on
That's right.
undocumented folks. We're still working on LGBTQ issues and especially transgender issues. Yeah, so, and of course, our world. How do we take care of our world, our natural environment, and how do we be good stewards of the earth? So, but yes, I think that'll be the overarching.
Well, and I
focus.
think that, and I don't mean to cut you off, Charlotte, but I think one of the things that's really fascinating is that what we're seeing is as we're beginning to understand this, as we're taking this more anthropological view of white supremacy, we're finding that it actually is in all these other things too, right? Like white supremacy is in how we choose Louisville, where I live. You can see where the chemical plants are in the black neighborhoods. Right? And that was done on purpose because the black neighborhoods were disempowered. They didn't have the power to be able to say, the privilege to be able to say, not in my backyard. And so the chemical plants were put there. So racial justice and environmental justice are intricately linked. Obviously, undocumented immigrants, nobody's talking about the white undocumented immigrants from Ireland, right? They're all talking about people of color, undocumented immigrants, so there's a racial connection there as well. I think there's something back there.
Back, the lady in the back.
Is there ever an appropriate time for UU to weld a gun in defense of others?
Is there ever an appropriate time for a Unitarian Universalist to wield a gun in defense of others? We are not a pacifist religion. We are a what is your conscience dictate to you religion. Unlike the Quakers, we have not taken a stand as a faith tradition that there is only one way to work for justice. We have leaned heavily towards nonviolence, and many in our congregations lean towards nonviolence, and that is absolutely fine. But I like to remind folks that we have not taken a stand that we are a nonviolent peace church. So I'm not going to answer that question specifically. I don't know. I can think, my mind is creative enough that I can absolutely think of circumstances where that would be appropriate. But that would be for each person to decide, not for me as a minister or Charlotte as a minister to decide for you. This is part of our search for truth and meaning.
Agreed.
Oh, I wasn't able to go to New Orleans, but I watched a lot of it on the internet. And I got the drift that there's a real big feeling that in the upper echelon of the administration of the UUA that there are too many white men in power. And so we talk about white supremacy. Why don't we talk about white male supremacy? I mean, I understand that there's a lot of female ministers in the Unitarian Church, but at the higher level, I mean, Jim Key, as he's going out the door, has a big fat bonus to some of these white guys that quit. So I understand there's going to be some programs to do something about this. How's that going?
I mean, you're right. There's been definitely discussion about all that stuff. And my understanding is that they've set a goal for themselves by a certain year that certain percentage of the administration team will be diverse. I haven't heard necessarily as
People
gender.
of color and indigenous people. 40% of people in management within the next, I think, 5 to 10 years will be people of color and indigenous people.
Yeah, well, we continue to have a problem of male supremacy. It's the men who want
Amen! Right? We have it everywhere. And this is one of the ways. Right. So thank you.
Everywhere.
Thank you, because this is also one of the ways, like, it is connected to white supremacy, because white supremacy really does mean white male supremacy, but we don't say that very often.
Well, it's heavily embedded in religion. I mean,
It's heavily embedded in religion.
White guy up in the sky, it all comes from that.
It's embedded in our country, in our founding documents of our country, that, the white men were able to own property and nobody else was. I mean, it's everywhere. So thank you, yes. And I think that what we're seeing is as we begin to listen to voices that have been pushed to the margins, whether they are people of color and indigenous people or women's voices, or LGBTQAI voices, right? Voices around differing sexual orientation and gender identities. There we go. People, as we listen to more of those voices, what we're finding is that white men in particular, not all white men, I can't believe I just said that, my daughter would kill me, but many are getting very defensive. And so there's a fascinating dynamic taking place right now within Unitarian Universalism, where white men, and in society, where white men who have always just assumed to have all this privilege and power are being challenged for the first times and asked to share some of their privilege and power, and it's very difficult for many of them to do that.
And our denomination is now majority female ministers. We're the only ones in at least the United States that that's the case.
Yep.
I think we're, 60, 40 or 53, whatever.
Yeah, there are significantly more women ministers, and yet women ministers still get paid less than men.
Right.
And women ministers are still chosen less frequently for the big congregations, the big pulpits.
So we're at a point now, I think, where we're in this, at the adolescence, if you will, where we're, charging ahead, we're challenging things, we're questioning things, we're trying to expand our knowledge of ourselves and the world around us, and I think it's, it's exciting and tumultuous at the same time.
I think you were next with the pink hair.
Kind of harkening back to the earlier discussion of the roots of the UU. I remember when I first started coming here, this is, as a self-identifying queer person, this is the first congregation where I've ever truly felt welcome. And because of my experience with various branches of Christianity and the churches there, I was really surprised to find that the UU had its origins in Christianity. So I was wondering I was just kind of curious if from the very beginning, was the UU already very progressive compared to other branches of Christianity at the time? Or has it kind of been like a journey over the last several hundred years where, as our understanding of gender and sexuality has grown, it's kind of had to grow with it, as opposed to other branches of Christianity where there's been a lot of pushback and more resistance?
Yeah, I want to say that we've always been pretty darn progressive. Now, progressive within our circumstances, right? So progressive now looks much different than progressive in the 1800s, right? But we've sort of been at the forefront of all progressive movements in the history of the U.S. So to be universalist, right, is to believe that everyone is worthy of going to heaven, right? That everyone is worthy of saving. That in and of itself is radical and progressive, right? So if you truly believe that, putting it into action would require that you would be radical and progressive.
You know, I think that if you watch the threads of the history of Universalists and of the Unitarians, it was almost inevitable that they would come together, and that when they came together, that it was inevitable that they would create something completely new. Because they proclaimed two things that were earth-shattering, and when you got those two together, it just busted all the walls open. That all people are lovable and loved, and will be reunited with the divine eventually, however you understand that, and that we must. It is essential that we understand the scriptures. And by the scriptures, we also use that to mean our own experiences in life, not just the biblical scriptures, but the poets and the wisdom of the ages and our own life experiences, that we examine those through the fire of thought, and that we use our reason exactly to apply to how we understand the world. And when you put both of those together, I mean, you're just gonna blow the roof off.
Maria?
So going from there, we've talked a lot about the mental components and the emotional components. Where does spirit and spirituality fit into Unitarian Universalism?
That's a really good question.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. We've talked about the emotional and the mental aspect of it, and Maria's asking, where does the spirit fit in? Do you want to take a stab at that? No, me? Okay, go for it. So spirituality, like, is one of those words that you use sometimes have a problem with, because it has so much baggage behind it, right? Because some of us have come from traditions in which spirituality took one form, and that form was crammed down your throat, and you accepted it or you didn't accept it. And for others, we understand that spirituality is very unique to each of us, and that it takes different forms. And I'll just give an example about, most of you know that I work as a chaplain on the side in a hospital, and part of my job is to do a spiritual evaluation, right? And really what that means, in the largest understanding of it, is what do you hold to be most important in your life? And do you have a way to express it, to nurture it? Do you have people in your life that support you in that expression? For some people, being spiritual means going for a walk with their family every Sunday. And that nourishes that aspect of them that feels sacred and holy and important. And for others, it means going to church and singing together, because raising your voice in song is a way that allows you to transcend your physical being, right? And it can take many different forms. I think, as our foremost religious educator would say, spirituality is in everything. It is infused in everything. It is infused in our social justice work. It is infused in our services, hopefully. It is infused in how we are together with one another. It is that cause which directs us into goodness, is how I would describe it for myself, if you will. Anything else? Do you want to add anything to that?
I think I love what you said, Charlotte. That was lovely. I think the only thing I would add is one of the things I've heard is that, and I like this, you can be spiritual by yourself, but you can't be religious by yourself. That religion is being spiritual with a group of people. And I like that distinction.
Did that answer your question, Maria?
It's a good start.
Ted, did you still have a question first?
I just wanted to comment that it was my impression that the history, related to the history question of Unitarianism, was that in the 19th century, that Unitarianism was very much the established kind of religion and fairly conservative. And it's transformed since then. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, it was and it wasn't at the same time. I mean, they had broken off from the established religion, so they were still the outsiders. And yet they pretty much then became very established themselves at the same time in New England.
And Emerson broke that apart with his divinity school address,
Right.
I'd say.
Right.
So yeah, there is a strain to that. Certainly, they went through the same periods of growth. But out of Unitarianism, we got the Humanist Manifesto, the First Humanist Manifesto in the 30s and 1930s, and so that was and we got Transcendentalism, and we got all these really important streams that sort of shot out of that. So established, but also perhaps open to
Pushing.
Yes.
Pushing.
the envelope.
When did Unitarianism officially become a non-Christian religion?
We have not officially
Yeah.
become a non-Christian
The
religion.
decree.
If you go to different congregations around the country, you will find that some are still very Christian. Some do communion, a very Christian communion every Sunday. Some do it less frequently. So it really depends on the congregation that you're in.
And at the UUA level, it's not a Christian religion.
At the UUA level, it depends on who you talk to.
Really?
Mhm.
Yes, I agree. I attended a church up in Salem, Massachusetts during Give School just once. They said the Lord's Prayer, and it was shocking to me. And I was like, okay, maybe this isn't my spiritual home, right? But what I found, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you probably know more about this, is that in the South, we tend to be more humanist-oriented, as almost a reaction against our surroundings, right? This is more of a safe haven, if you will. And up north, it tends to be, or at least in the churches I've been to, more Christocentric. Maybe not so much as saying the Lord's Prayer every Sunday or doing communion, but much more free with religious language and Christianity and all those things because of the area that they're in.
I have found that New England is definitely, there are more congregations that are called consolidated congregations that are UU and UCC or Disciples of Christ or a mainline Protestant tradition, so they're consolidated. I find in the South, folks are often more, the Midwest is much more humanist than I've experienced the South. The Midwest has humanist congregations that you can argue over why they're even called Unitarian Universalist, because they are a humanist congregation. I find the South to be somewhere in between. That general theism is more accepted in different parts of the southern region, and even the humanism isn't as sort of dogmatically humanist as it is in the Midwest. It's interesting.
Amanda.
I've heard the universalist concept of salvation for everyone. That everyone has. My question is, I've been talking to people I work with, friends of mine, about what I've learned so far, and people have actually come up to me and said, well, if you're part of this church or you wear that T-shirt, does that mean that you believe Jesus Christ saved everyone?
Historically, is that the end of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, and I guess my question is, because then they say, well, that's my understanding of the universalist part of the UU. And they said, well, where in the Bible is that?
It's in there.
It's in there.
And I'm like, I don't know, I didn't read it.
But see, that's the thing. You don't want to argue them on their terms, right? Like you don't necessarily want to argue them on their terms. It is in there, absolutely, it's in there, huh? But see, no, if you do that, they're just going to quote another scripture right back at you, right? So the argument is the argument that Hosea Ballou gave to people, and that argument is that Hosea Ballou believed that God could not be any less loving than the most amazing, wonderful parent. Father was his language, right? That there is no way God would be less loving than the most loving father on earth. That is not possible. And the most loving father on earth would never doom their child to hell for eternity. For eternity. Ever. And that therefore, because God is better than humans, God would never doom God's children to suffering for eternity. And so that's the argument you make when you get asked. Because if you just start quoting the Bible back at them, they're going to know the Bible better than you are. They're going to find another scripture, and you're validating their argument that the Bible is the only source of truth and wisdom. So if you're able to take the argument onto your own plane and use that metaphor of parenthood, then you're able to challenge. You can say, and what Hosea Ballou did was he rode around the countryside. He was a circuit rider, and he had a Baptist minister that he would ride the circuit with, and he was the Baptist minister was making exactly this argument, and he was like, well, Hosea, what, and somehow, he talked about throwing the minister's son into the next bonfire because the son was disobeying. And the minister was like, what? Why would I throw my son into the bonfire just because he disobeyed? Exactly. Right, exactly. So don't go to the biblical scriptures because there are sources of wisdom much beyond them, and they're going to know them better than you. So go to metaphor and go to story and go to something that speaks to their heart, not to their head.
I don't think it's in the scripture.
It is. There is one line of scripture that says Jesus Christ died for all men.
Right.
Oh,
Men.
it is you.
Yeah, but I mean, there are men in here, so
That's right.
Yeah, so it is in there, but she's right. It's tit for tat, right? For every scripture you pull up, there's another scripture that defies it, right? So skipping over that, you could do that all day long, but skipping over that and saying, like,
Oh, yeah.
this is the message, this is the greater message, making it personal by asking them that exact question.
Oh, God is too good to condemn us.
I think
One more question.
Okay, is our church, is our denomination growing on a national, international level?
So is Unitarian Universalism growing on a national, international level? So what I can tell you is that if you break the United States up into regions, there are some regions where Unitarian Universalism is growing, and there are some regions where it is not. It is not growing, and we are shrinking rapidly by number up in the New England region. And the reason for that is New England in general is becoming less pious and church-going as a whole. They're becoming more secularized. So they're just, church attendance is dropping off in general there, and we're suffering from that. The southern region is the only region that is growing in both adult membership and children's religious education participation. And that's because we haven't yet hit quite the same, well, for one, we haven't had the market penetration is what it's called, that there is in New England. There just isn't a church on every corner here. And so there's still room to expand, but also because the South is still more church going in general. It matters that you go to church and people will ask you, so what church do you go to? The Midwest is growing in numerical numbers, but not in children's religious education, and the Pacific West region is pretty much stagnant. What's interesting though is that as a percentage of the population of the United States, we are shrinking. So our numbers may be growing, but as a percentage of the population of the United States, we are shrinking. And there's a lot of questions and curiosity around why that is, and I have my own very strong opinions that I will not share, but we can talk afterwards.
And I would add that we saw growth in our community when we were vocal about our values, right? When we were most vocal, we saw people saying, holy crap, here is a church who is doing what I want to be, who is living out their values in such a loud, focused way, in a way that I believe we should be living out our values personally. So let me check that out. And so I can see in the South why we would be growing for that reason as well, because this era is calling us to be more vocal about our values. And the more vocal we are, I think the more we'll tap into those people who just didn't know that we existed prior.
There's an urgency to Unitarian Universalism in the South that it's one of the reasons I took the job with the Southern region, because I think our faith is more important, needs to shine brighter here in the South, because there are so many forces that will try to tell people that you're not good enough, that you're not whole enough, that you are not enough, and that who you love is not enough. And so we have this amazing, life-saving faith that in the South is even more of a beacon than it is elsewhere in the country because of the forces that surround us.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you all so much, and I'll be hanging around, so afterwards, feel free to ask me anything else.
So generosity is a spiritual discipline, and because of your generosity this morning, we have a warm and welcoming building to enter.